Hey guys, and welcome to the fourth video in this tutorial series. And today we're going to be covering methods, returning values, and parameters or arguments. And this, as I said, last video was a vital part of RSBot scripting. And of course, RSBot scripting is not limited to the onStart, the loop, and the onFinish methods, although you can make scripts only with these three methods. It's strongly suggested that you use more methods. And the basis of all programming is what's called top-down programming, which is in your loop you say, if you're at the bank, you deposit. If you're at the mine, you mine ores. But of course, you cannot write directly if at bank. That's just nonsense. The method at bank is undefined for the type iMiner, and indeed it is. We don't have this method yet made. This method is not supplied by RSBot, so this is not one of these onStart, loop, or onFinish methods, and we don't have it made inside our script. So we have to make this atBank method, and that's pretty simple. To make a method, we just write private, and then whether our method is going to return a value or not. Notice how we are doing if atBank. This means if the value returned by this method is true, which basically is going to mean that we are at the bank, then we do something. So this method must be Boolean. And it must be Boolean because it has to return either true or false. And depending on that value, we're going to do something or something different in our loop. And then the name of our method, it must be the same in both places. So in this case, at bank is the name of my method. And we just open these brackets, these curly braces, and here we're going to write what our method does. Remember that the statements are executed sequentially from beginning to end, so we have to write this in a logical manner. And notice that the atBank method is underlined in red, and this method must return a result of type Boolean, and indeed we have to return either true or false, and we'll get to that in a moment. Basically, what we want to write in this method is how do we know if we are at the bank. How, in real life, how do we know we are at the bank or not? The first thing we know is that we know we're at the bank if we see a bank booth nearby. If we see a bank booth, obviously we are inside a bank, or there is a bank booth randomly inside a forest or something like that. Not very usual stuff. So if we see a bank booth, we know we're at the bank, and therefore we can bank. Of course, I don't know which code for a bank. Actually, I do. So the first thing before coding our method is getting the data we're going to need. So RSBot controls everything there is in the RuneScape world by assigning them IDs. So the banks have certain IDs, and if that ID is around your character, you can see it on the screen. Obviously you are in a bank booth because you can see the ID of the bank booth, which is unique. So we say int, which stands for integer, booth ID is equal to 11402, and this is a bank booth ID for Barak. So if now we're going to do something, we're going to return true if this ID can be seen nearby. So if this ID is inside our screen, it means we're at the bank, and it also means we can click the bank, but that's something we'll worry about later on. But how do we do this? We cannot say if a booth ID can be seen around. We have to use one of the methods provided to us by RSBot, and this method unfortunately cannot be used on integer variables. So I cannot do anything like can be seen. That doesn't exist. First thing I have to do is create an RS object, which is basically anything in RuneScape which has that ID. So I'm going to create an RS object with that ID, and I'm going to compare that RS object with every other RS object in the screen, and if it matches, it means that I've got a bank booth inside my screen. So how do we do this? Well, the first thing, we need to call a method inside objects. And this is pretty straightforward stuff. Okay. So, if the nearest object with this ID, basically the objects class has a method called getNearest, and we're getting the nearest object with the ID booth ID. So we get the nearest object with this ID, but that method obviously doesn't return true or false. It wouldn't make sense if the nearest object booth ID, yeah, we get it, but that's pretty much it. So we want to perform an additional check. So we're gonna look here for a method, and we could use two different ways. We could either get location and then check for if that location is on our screen, or we could directly use is on screen. And this is the suggested method. And now this makes more sense. If the nearest object we get with this ID is on the screen, now that returns true or false. That's pretty straightforward. Then we do something, and if that object, which with the bank booth ID, is on our screen, obviously we can see a bank booth nearby, so we are in the bank. And we can do that. However, there's a small flaw in our method, which is, well, there are two flaws actually. The first one, if this method can be seen, we return true. But what if it can't be seen? What do we return? We have to tell it something. So outside the if block, the if statement, we write return false. And now there's one more problem. I explained the getting of objects as saying we create a new object independent of the one in RuneScape, and we compare it. But actually something a bit more complicated. We actually get all the possible objects, we get all the IDs that are around, and we see if any of those IDs match the ID here, and then we create the object. So the first thing we have to know is whether there's a bank or not. And when we know if there's a bank or not, we can check for if it's on our screen or not. So that complicates things a bit. We cannot run directly this code without first checking for if there is a bank booth or not. So the first thing we do is we're going to move this to here. So we've now stored the this object inside a new variable. We have to import the wrappers, always the wrappers, never the client thing. So we import wrappers, and we've stored it in a bank. And if bank is not null, and null means nothing. So if the bank is something, then we can proceed into checking whether we are the bank or not. So let me run through what this means. We first of all create the method. It's a private method because it doesn't get access from other classes. It's a Boolean method because it returns true or false, and it's called @bank. The first thing we do is create a new RS object in which we are going to store the bank booth. And if that bank booth is not null, this means there is a bank booth somewhere. Then we're going to perform this, and that checks for if the bank booth is on our screen or not. Basically, the null, this will be null. This RS object will be null if the bank booth is not inside our loaded area of RuneScape. You know that every time you walk a certain distance, RuneScape tells you loading, please wait. Well, inside your current area, if there's a bank, this will say not null. If there is no bank inside the area, for example, if you're in the middle of the wilderness, it will say null. And then we check if the bank is on the screen or not. And finally, if it is, we return true, and if it isn't, we return false. So that was pretty much the @bank method. We didn't cover parameters here, but we'll do soon. but we did cover return values. So now in our loop, we can check for if we are the bank. And if we are the bank, we can do something. For example, we can deposit stuff in the bank. But we'll get to how to do that in a later lesson. For the moment, let's leave it at where it is. Remember to subscribe and tune in for the next video.